look at what President Trump, for example, the kinds of statements that he made, Islam hates us, etc. And many of the major people in President Trump's cabinet were people who were associated with Islamophobic organizations. One candidate said that he could not see a Muslim being president of the United States.
Professor, as a Pakistani, when I think of Islamophobia, I reckon to first start off by looking inwards. The treatment of religious minorities in Pakistan, the alleged forced conversion of Hindu girls, the exploitation of the blasphemy law and its use against religious minorities, attacks on churches, etc.
The good news is we don't have many Muslims. The bad news is we have Islamophobia. And the same has been said with regard to Australia. I think then they have to be called out.
Assalamu alaikum and hello. Welcome to New Wave Global. Here with you, I am Faryad. The United Nations has declared March 15 as the International Day to combat Islamophobia. This year, March 15 also marked the 4th anniversary of the 2019 terrorist attacks on 2 mosques in Christchurch in New Zealand. Islamophobia manifests itself in various forms, mostly driven by discrimination, bias, suspicion, and outright hatred towards Muslims and Islam. In view of the dire need to combat Islamophobia and other forms of religious discrimination, Muslims need to act, failing to do which would have us dubbed Muslim couch potatoes, a phrase rightly coined by world-renowned scholar and researcher, Dr. John Esposito. And I'm thrilled and highly honored to welcome him here with me today. Dr. John Esposito is the Professor of Religion, International Affairs and Islamic Studies at the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He's also the founding director of Prince Al-Walid Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding at Georgetown University and author of over 55 books and monographs, including The Future of Islam, Islamophobia and the Challenge of Pluralism in the 21st Century, What Everyone Needs to Know About Islam, and Who Speaks for Islam, What a Billion Muslims Really Think. Dr. Esposito is also editor-in-chief, the Oxford Encyclopedia of Islamic World, and has been the president of the American Academy of Religion. He was also a member of the World Economic Forum's Council of 100 Leaders. Professor, thank you so much for your time. I'm really honored to have you here.
I'm delighted to join you. Thank you.
We are aware of the core issues of extremism and terrorism reinforcing Islamophobia, but there has also been an inexorable surge in ethno-nationalism and ultra-supremacist ideologies, with far-right ideologues targeting vulnerable populations across the globe. At the same time, there hasn't been much social or democratic evolution. I will quote from a Freedom House report where they tell us that between a period of 2006 to 2018, at least 113 countries backed away from democracy. Has an overall decline in democratic processes and the existence of flawed democracies also led to the exponential growth of ideologies that encourage Islamophobia?
I think so. I think that if you take a look, for example, at statements that are come out of the far right in the United States, the United States, we've prided ourselves on being a democracy, having religious pluralism, etc. But look at what President Trump, for example, the kinds of statements that he made. Islam hates us, etc. And many of the major people in President Trump's cabinet were people who were associated with Islamophobic organizations. The Secretary of State at that time. And a variety of people, and even in the elections before that, in terms of the Republican Party in particular, their platform has often had this kind of rhetoric, talking about fear of Sharia, or that one candidate said that he could not see a Muslim being president of the United States. So I think that it's there. And I think if you look at Europe, if you look at the policies in France and Australia, et cetera, it's very much influenced by a kind of far right mentality.
So Islamophobia, like other systems of bias, operates in both liberal and conservative spaces. Islamophobia by conservatives is easily identifiable through hate speech and hate crimes. Now, the absence of such noticeable factors in liberal circles and the stealth of liberal Islamophobia makes it more insidious, where we talk of pluralism and diversity and inclusion, and yet there's heightened scrutiny of Muslims and an underlying implicit bias. How do we tackle this type of hypocrisy of liberal Islamophobia when we talk of combating the latter?
Well, I think that, basically wherever it exists, and the way you know that is by what people say and do. And if they are in many ways, people who are seen as, let's say, liberal politicians or whatever, when it comes to dealing with Muslims or dealing with questions of immigration, then you begin to see where the reality of it is. So, for example, one of the issues that's been raised by both, I think, a variety of people is that when you consider the response that's occurred in the West in general, in particular in Europe, to the influx, the high immigration from Muslim countries, without their contextualizing why are all of these people leaving. Very often it's because of what occurred in their country, but what occurred in their country when the West was also involved, in, for example, the politics of the Middle East, support for regimes, particularly the rise of militants like ISIS, et cetera. But on the other hand, on something I feel very strongly and support for the Ukraine, but when it comes to immigrants from the Ukraine, countries that normally have a problem with Muslims, that is in their approach towards Muslims, like Poland, as one scholar said at a conference, a Polish scholar, she was half kidding and making the point. She said, the good news is we don't have many Muslims. The bad news is we have Islamophobia. And the same thing, has been said with regard to Australia. I think then they have to be called out in terms of why a double standard when it comes to the attitude, outlook, and even policies that are supported that are discriminatory with regard to Muslims.
So anti-Semitism and Islamophobia seem to have a correlation. I mean, there's in fact an empirical link between the two. Could you tell us, Professor, if it's across the board bias and racism that make the link so profound, or are there other factors here at play as well?
No, I think that it's basically the extent to which we have a far right nationalist, and sometimes the people involved also are far right religiously. The net result is that you're right. If you look today, there's been a significant increase in anti-Semitism in the United States and outside of the United States, and the same thing, and of Islamophobia. But at times in the U.S., I would say today, the anti-Semitism and the threat of it is even stronger than the problem of Islamophobia.
Oh, really?
Yes, I mean the number of attacks that have occurred on synagogues, or attempted attacks, are very troubling. Now, what is interesting too is that whereas before the primary concern of our intelligence people was dealing with Muslim extremism, which of course they should be concerned about Muslim extremists, but that was the primary. Now they talk about the primary is far right nationalist, and as I said, some of these folks are far right religious nationalists.
So there's
America should be a Christian country, that kind of, comment. It's both an issue of race.
that must be applying across the board. I mean, to Hindus as well, and to other Buddhists, so maybe to other minorities too.
This is perfect. What you're saying is spot on. What we have today is the globalization of Islamophobia. I've just returned from Doha, where we ran a program there, a conference, and Oxford University Press will be publishing a volume, a collection that I and Professor Sahar Aziz have done on basically the globalization of Islamophobia and the rise of populism. And that's what we are very much, seeing today to a very dangerous degree.
So there's also this belief, particularly in the West, that Islam and democracy are mutually exclusive. They're not compatible. They are like two contradictory doctrines. What is your take on this?
I've written on it, and others have too. It is totally inaccurate and foolish. If they want to say that there are many Muslim countries that are authoritarian and not democratic, but that very often is due to the nature of regimes, it's not being done in the name of religion. So when you look at a number of the Gulf states, etc., and it's not just the Gulf states, I think that's what's forgotten. All of this goes back in many ways to, people have to realize, for many in the West, and certainly I saw this, when I finished my degree in the 1970s, there were no jobs. There was no great interest in Islam. The American Academy of Religion that you referred to, which is the kind of academy to look at religions, didn't have a special section on Islam until the mid-1980s. Diplomats were not really in their training dealing with Islam and the Muslim world until the mid-1980s. Our schools, most of our schools and universities didn't cover this, didn't cover this area. So that's a background. And then you got the Iranian Revolution, when suddenly with modern technology, people could see it live, and they see people shouting death to America, death to the West. And then you get 9/11. All of that then feeds, the stereotyping of the vast majority of Muslims at the, and doesn't distinguish between the very dangerous and deadly, but small fraction of Muslims who are extremists and terrorists, and the religion in general. And then that leads to notions of anti-democracy. Now, if you look at a book that Dalia Mogahad and I did, which is based on a series of Gallup global surveys, when Muslims were asked what they wanted, majorities said they wanted democratic governments, elections, and many of the human rights, etc. So it's really a total distortion of the reality.
Also, a lot of the beliefs and doctrines of democracy are very much aligned with those of Islam. And I'm sure that holds true for other religions as well, Christianity too. Human rights, you talk of equality, you talk of inclusivity. All these things are a part of the major religions. I don't think there's a religion that would say, go and exploit human rights or deny people the human rights.
You're right, but I think the thing to note is that in all of these religions, there are extremists. So when you look at what's gone on in Myanmar or Burma, okay, you've had extremist Buddhists. I've done work in Buddhism, but these are extremist Buddhists who have joined with the military in what happened, there in terms of the repression, as well as when you look at what's going on in India. There are extremist Hindus. You've got Hindutva. You've got a significant number. And in many ways, Mr. Modi has been associated with the RSS and this Hindutva mentality, which basically says India is a Muslim country. I'm sorry, a Hindu country, should be a Hindu country. And that many of these other minorities, particularly Muslims, but also Sikhs and others, should be marginalized, if not driven out. For the extremists, they just believe, they should be driven out of India.
Yeah, I will be coming to that in one of my later questions. US and EU are accused of having double standards when it comes to promotion and support of democracy in the Middle East, right? Just like you yourself just mentioned, as well as other states. For example, in Egypt, when Morsi's government was removed by Sisi through a coup, the then president, Obama, didn't openly declare it a coup. Is the US and EU's selective espousal of democracy and human rights in Muslim world also a reason for a decline in democracy world over? I know you've already touched that, but if you could just expand a little on what you just...
It's not really recent. I mean, George W. Bush, in his second term, now, this is against the background which then he was going to invade Iraq and talk about doing it for the sake of democracy. But George W. Bush quite rightly said that presidents before him, both Democrat and Republican, had practiced democratic exceptionalism. That was the phrase that he used. So we promote democracy and we say we promote democracy, but the Middle East was an exception. And that's precisely what happened. And that's what then I think affected the response when Sisi, first of all, the response when Mubarak fell. If you look at statements that were made in the immediate after period, you had the Secretary of State and the President, but you heard two different kinds of statements. One would say Mubarak is a longtime ally, and the other would say, but we respect the right of the people. And then when the coup came, at the end of the day, as you said, Obama avoided the word coup even when he was pressed on it. And the fact is, as a scholar of the region and somebody who had served, not me, somebody else in government, said, a coup is a coup is a coup. When you have a military-led takeover of the government, it is a coup. And at the end of the day, both the US and the EU, within a very short period of time, even though they expressed concern, returned to business as usual.
Also, post-Arab Spring, I think many secular authoritarian rulers in the Middle East and the Muslim world, they were also sort of instrumentalizing discourses around Islamophobic rhetoric to remain in power and sort of delegitimize popular uprisings emerging across the Arab region. And perhaps this was also one of the reasons that Islamophobia did sort of, come out from where it should not have. Because
you're right. I think a number of governments in the region that were themselves and are authoritarian governments, some of them were responsible for support for the coup in Egypt. Not only as it were political or moral support, but even financial support, both before and then after the coup. And the fear in the region was not that the Muslim Brotherhood specifically, for example, was going to come to their country. It was that the example of what went on in Egypt and in Tunisia, and also in other countries, like Libya, but certainly, Egypt and Tunisia, that example would feed the potential problems within their own country. And so many of them, excuse me, became even more authoritarian, and particularly their message to people at the end of the day was that the Muslim Brotherhood was a terrorist group and responsible for terrorism globally, in the region, but also in other parts of the world. And what they wanted to undermine was the notion that any kind of Islamic movement or Islamic political party, was dangerous.
Islamophobia has become a global industry now. The Center for American Progress, one of its reports, I think it was the 2015 report, Fear Incorporation, where they tell us how anti-Muslim activists and propagandists and pseudo think tanks, they receive huge amounts of funds from at least 7 charitable foundations over some period to churn out anti-Muslim material. Is this a reality as stark?
Well, and I think they actually said something like, I forget, $40 million, but a study done later by CARE and a center at the University of California at Berkeley, a joint study over, I think, something like a 5-year period, looking at the IRS or tax returns, found that something like $205 million had actually gone to the creation of the websites, as well as existing websites and authors supporting them. So social media has had a tremendous impact. And the fact is, it wasn't just that it had, when it's social media, it's not an impact just in the United States. When it's social media, it means globally.
Across the globe, it goes
Yeah.
everywhere. Yeah. Coming to Europe, you've just talked a little about Europe. The far right, we know, has combined Islamophobia with racism and anti-immigrant sentiment to create a very toxic atmosphere for Muslims and people of color. France has been championing restrictions on the hijab. There are vile examples of Quran burning in different European states. This illustrates the continent's medieval animus for Islam. We know Norway, Hungary, France, Sweden, Netherlands, recently Australia, the vandalization of Islamic symbols. What makes Europe more hostile towards Muslims and Islam than North America?
Well, I think that one should also note that in Europe, you have had a series of attacks, significant attacks at times, by Muslim extremists in the UK, very much in France, and I think that triggers what we're talking about. But the reality of it is that the response has not been, again, to say we have a dangerous extremism here that we have to deal with, but recognize that it's deadly, but it is not representative of mainstream Islam. It is not representative of the vast majority of Muslims. And so then what you see in countries like France and Austria recently is a kind of mentality that really and legislation is suspicious of and wants to define what it means to be French or Austrian in a way that would in a sense expect that it could control Muslim civil society or civil society leaders. So if you look at the French situation, which you cited, you had them closing down mosques. You had them closing down the main Muslim organization, which monitored what was going on in the country and was not extremist at all. And it reflected almost the mentality of the far right, of like Le Pen, who basically believes that for Muslims to be acceptable and live and practice their faith, in a sense, they have to be French politically, culturally, linguistically, etc. And I think in Austria, you have, and people can go to our website, bridge.georgetown.edu, and see all kinds of coverage of this. But in Austria, you had something like 900 security and police raiding the homes of some 60 or 70 families, literally breaking down doors with their weapons drawn, seizing all of their equipment, and then for a couple of years, freezing their bank accounts, etc., so that some of these people couldn't even afford in that situation to hire lawyers. Now, all of this is again, it's documented in many sources, but at our Bridge website, we have a good deal of that. This is where governments are really implementing a kind of a far right mentality in which the acceptable Muslim in France and Austria is being defined by the government, and the acceptable, as it were, imam and mosque is being, attempting to define that, rather than they're targeting the real extremist.
And also, I think most right-wing movements across the world, they take their cues from European movements and marginalize Muslims within their lands. For example, the hijab ban, when it started in France in 2004, it was taken up by other nations, and there were nations adopting Islamophobic policies as well. We know the southern state of Karnataka in India they also had a similar ban. So probably this is, I think, one of the worst parts of all these movements that begin in Europe, that they are extremely susceptible to being spread across the globe. A US Institute for Social Policy and Understanding study states that domestic terrorist attacks did not directly correlate with a spike in anti-Muslim sentiments, but it was instead the presidential elections, a run-up to the Iraq war, and a biased media that led to increase in anti-Muslim feelings. Well, we had been thinking all along that it was Islamophobia was at its highest post 9/11.
It basically what you do have is, I mean, reformulate that question for me.
So what I'm trying to ask is that what this report says is that the domestic terrorist attacks do not directly correlate with a spike in anti-Muslim sentiments as much as the president elections, a run-up to the Iraq war, and a biased media. All three of these put together are more of a trigger towards Islamophobia than terrorist attacks within the US.
Within the US, that's true.
Yeah.
See, I wanted to get that. Within the US, that is true. And if you go back and you look at elections, even before the Trump election, if you look at previous elections, the Republican Party already had candidates who were saying things like Sharia was going to be implemented in the US, or as one of them, a former leading politician, Newt Gingrich, said that Muslims should be asked whether or not they follow Sharia, and if they do, they should be basically sent out of the country. Not even, they demonstrate, they don't even understand what Sharia is or what it means. You had candidates that made it clear that they couldn't see a Muslim, in their cabinet, etc. All of that was there before. But with Trump, you had some of the strongest statements, when he said Islam hates us. And then when he talked about it and said that he would, among other things, that he would freeze the number of Muslims able to come into the country, and did that almost within weeks after he was elected. And if you actually look at that administration, and again, if you go to the Bridge website, people like the Secretary of State, a variety of members of the Trump White House and of the Trump government were people who made public anti-Muslim statements or were associated with organizations that were Islamophobic, even accepted, in some cases, awards from them, recognition.
So United Nations Secretary General says that Muslim women suffer triple discrimination in terms of Islamophobic bias due to their gender, ethnicity, and faith. How could you elaborate this?
Yeah, well, it's a very depressing situation. You've got in some areas, you've got in general a non-acceptance of the equality of women in general, whether they're Muslim or not. But then you move into the anti-Muslim bias, and so then you go for the symbols of Islam, and the hijab is a physical and public symbol. We still have incidents that occur. I teach at Georgetown University, and on occasion you see reports of a Georgetown student who might be wearing a hijab on the streets in very nice neighborhoods around Georgetown, having incidents of either being verbally abused or at times even physically attacked. So I think that that again, if you look globally at the situation across the world, women wearing hijab, I would say in many parts of Europe, are seen as symbols of almost a religious or cultural threat. And it's playing out in India very clearly. You've had the ban on hijab, in a number
they're more easier to target, like in so many other types of discrimination women and children usually are the easiest victims. Professor, as a Pakistani, when I think of Islamophobia, I reckon to first start off by looking inwards. The treatment of religious minorities in Pakistan, the alleged forced conversion of Hindu girls, the exploitation of the blasphemy law and its use against religious minorities, attacks on churches, etc. And then raising my voice against Islamophobia, wouldn't that be termed as a slight bit of double standards if I do that?
Well, I think that, no, I don't think so. I think that it seems to me, individuals call it the way it is. I mean, you know, I can tell you that the kind of environment that existed under President Trump and still within the United States, there are significant issues with regard to Islamophobia. I don't think it's a double standard if I'm out raising the issue and denouncing it, even if it exists in my country, you know, and exists in a strong way. I think that one has to be careful and look very closely. I agree with you about a number of issues with regard to, at times, the status of Christians, also the use of the charge of blasphemy when it's not even true, you know, with regard to Christians, and then you wind up with people being either imprisoned or having to fear that they'll be killed. That's an issue. I think that when one gets into the question of intermarriage or forced, you know, then I think both there and also the accusation in India, one has to look very closely at that. In India, they call it, you know, sort of like marriage jihad. So what they're really saying is that Muslims are marrying Hindus deliberately to then convert them, and then the babies would all be Muslim. Well, that I think is an Islamophobic charge. I mean, I can't say that some specific incidents don't occur that way, but I think that that intermarriage is intermarriage. You know, I can remember a time when I was growing up that, for example, a Christian marrying somebody who was Jewish would be rejected by both families, that it would be a big issue. I can remember in the neighborhood that I was raised in, which was very much Italian and Catholic, which is my own background, having a couple that where it was Catholic, Jewish, they were engaged, and then at the end of the day, they didn't get married because of the pressure from families. So, you know, that also exists, but not necessarily in a non-violent situation, in a violent
It's
situation.
not always that those marriages are forced. I mean, that's what the girls' families usually say. But yes, there are allegations that in some of the cases, there are those marriages have been forced, and those girls have been forced to conversion to becoming Muslims. And also, speaking of the role that Pakistani leaders have played in combating Islamophobia, we know that Pakistan's former Prime Minister Imran Khan played a substantial role in facilitating the UN legislation on Islamophobia. And yet, Pakistan continues to ignore the plight of the Uyghur Muslims in China and the way they are being persecuted. While in neighboring India, the right-wing government of Modi, as you just yourself mentioned, has a high-handed attitude, and there are atrocities against Muslims, and we certainly do criticize that. Isn't this dichotomy and selective reprehension counterproductive in the fight against Islamophobia?
Absolutely. I think that, for example, I myself, I don't pick political candidates in Pakistan, but Imran Khan, from my point of view, I had great respect for him, and I still do. But what struck me, I watched, I think it was actually live, when the OIC had a meeting in Pakistan, which he hosted and chaired, and they had a session. He gave a brilliant speech against Islamophobia, but it was Islamophobia in the West. He did not refer to it anyplace else. And on the days near him was a representative of China sitting there throughout the whole thing. Now, I can understand, you know, that is, I can look and say, look, Pakistan has had a close relationship with China for many years, leading to the building of roads, etc. But the fact is that there's been a tendency in a number of Muslim countries to be very strong about Islamophobia, but equate it with the West and not look at and speak out against what's been happening in Burma, etc., or even in China. Some have, and I think that's something that has to change at some point.
Absolutely. So tell us a little about the Bridge Initiative at the Georgetown University. It says the Bridge Initiative, protecting pluralism and ending Islamophobia. So what are you doing under this initiative?
Yeah, as it turns out, going back to like the mid to late 90s, I had done a book in the early 90s called The Islamic Threat, Myth or Reality. And I think it was the second edition, I began to write about Islamophobia. But Islamophobia really didn't get picked up in a very public way and seen until about 2010, when the first time that a major publication, the Time magazine, on its cover asked, "Is America Islamophobic?" And it gave an example of something happening in America and featured that. Well, I continue to follow that, write on it. Some of my colleagues did. And then about 8 years ago, which is just about our 8th anniversary, I decided that we needed a special project because I saw that Islamophobia was not disappearing, but in fact was growing, within my own country. And at that point, within the West, in Europe. And so what we do is we have a website where people can go, for example, and sign up so that every day they will get an email from one of our top researchers, done by our associate director, Mubashira Tazmal, whose family comes from Pakistan. And she will list major articles internationally and even have summaries of those and a link to those articles. We also publish articles on exactly what's happening in specific countries, whether it's Austria, France, or we jump over to China, India, Myanmar. So we have articles that deal with that all of the time. Bridge has about 1.1 million followers, which is a very considerable following, and is very visible on Twitter and Instagram. And so that's been the work that we've done. And we now have a series of podcasts that are interesting for people that might be interesting, that we're beginning to expand. But that's the purpose. We look at Islamophobia globally.
That's great. So Professor Esposito says that with religious racism on the rise, what we need is robust political and religious pluralism, as he just also mentioned his initiative that he's taken up at the Georgetown University, also stepping forward and doing whatever we can in our individual and collective capacities to counter Islamophobia and all forms of religious discrimination is essential. As Muslims worldwide enter the holy month of Ramzan, a time of fasting and caring for communities, we hope that the world learns to coexist peacefully. Ideally, in a civilized world, there should be no place for discrimination and hatred based on race, religion, or ethnicity, but we are far from achieving this humanitarian ideal. Professor Esposito, talking to you was most insightful. Thank you for the great work that you're doing and your time. That's all for now. Allah Hafiz and goodbye.